Okay, so first of all, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Noble, for making the journey up from Dresden Forest. We're very grateful. And we start just by asking everyone if they could tell us their name, their date of birth, and where they were born.
Well, first of all, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, 1923, so I'm going on 83, 84 now, right now. But my name, John Noble.
Okay. And so you didn't come to Germany until the late 30s, is that?
That's correct. It was in 1938 when I came to Germany. My father had traded his U.S. business for a camera business in Dresden, and I came out, the whole family came over, and I immediately became involved in the factory.
Sorry, we're going to have to stop. The plane is just getting a little bit too good.
This is always the way.
Get ready.
Get running. Okay. So, Mr. Noble, so you were you had a form of internment during the war with the Nazis.
Correct.
People will be surprised that you weren't treated worse. I mean, that you weren't imprisoned, and was this purely because, well, America was at war with the Nazis, so why weren't you treated worse, do you think?
Well, I personally believe that the reason for that was that the cameras that we manufactured went almost exclusively to the United States or to the Western world. And the income from the factory was very much desired at taxes. The foreign currency coming in was desired at that time.
See, so it was actually in the Nazis' interests to let you carry on with the business.
That's correct.
But your personal life was restricted in some ways during that period?
Oh yes, it was restricted from September 3, 1939 on. That's the day when Britain entered into World War II, and because of the agreements between the Germans, the British and the Americans, we were treated like British. And we were restricted to the city of Dresden at that time, with all kind of limitations, the streetcars which we could use, the roads we could use, but we still were allowed to go to the factory. From 1941 on, it was a lot worse. We had to report to the police every third day. We had food. Our food rationing was cut down to the unemployed rations, which didn't bother us that much because we got Red Cross parcels from the West. Then we were never allowed to have more than 50 marks in our pocket. So these kind of restrictions.
And so, skipping ahead to the arrival of the Red Army troops, when were you first aware that things had changed and that the Red Army were here?
Well, see, we lived right on the slopes on the outskirts of at the city limit of Dresden, and we could see the whole valley. And it was a matter of knowing were the American troops coming first or were the Soviet troops coming first. And it was on May 6th, at about 6 in the morning, when the Soviet troops began to move in. And we could see through the binoculars from the home. We could see the Red Army soldiers on the streets.
And what did you feel about that?
It was, of course, a letdown for us. It was a letdown, I think, for everybody in Dresden, even though they had experienced a terrible air raid in 1945, in February 45, and many people were angry towards the West because of this air raid. But still, the rumors that already had spread as to what the Soviet soldiers were doing in other areas where they already had come in, and the refugees fleeing from there reported so much horror that was going on, so that the people really were hoping the American troops would come in first.
And so what kinds of things did you see or experience the Red Army soldiers, the Red Army people doing once they got to Dresden?
Well, the first we saw was in the house right next to ours. There were the Soviet troops went in, pulled the women out, raped the women. The men had to watch, and then the men were shot. Right at the end of the street, a woman was tied onto a wagon wheel, a dumped over wagon wheel, and was terribly misused. The people had the habit of banging on pots and pans when something was going on, hoping that someone would come to help, but nobody dared to go out on the street. As far as the factory was concerned, we weren't sure as to what was happening the first 2 to 3 days because we too didn't dare to go out. Had the American flag flying on the roof, so that it seemed as though the Soviets were respecting the flag, but we didn't have it at the factory, and so we were very much concerned about that. But we found that with the factory there was no trouble at all. As far as the Soviets were concerned, they were aware of what we were producing, the cameras that we were producing, the Praktiflex cameras, the forerunner to the Praktika. And we immediately got orders from the Red Army to continue to produce. And we were able to, but we wanted passes for all of our employees so they wouldn't be bothered. And those that most of them came by bicycle, that the bicycles weren't stolen on the way to work, and of course this happened all the time. So it was simply the Soviets would say the passes are good, but the bike is better. And we had girls in our factories that were misused time and time again from the Soviets. Small town outside of Pilnitz, the small town outside of Dresden, a town by the name of Pilnitz. Not one girl or woman between the ages of 7 and 70 was not raped.
And is this these things? Just to go back to the women you talked about being raped in the street and the men shot. Is this something you saw yourself?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Can you describe something that you saw it yourself? Because I think some people say, oh well, these are things you might have heard about, but just that you saw it yourself.
No, this happened right immediately on the street, right in the house, from the people from the house next door. As a matter of fact, because of this, the men being shot there were 2 Russians who were there as workers. Maybe I should explain. There was a trolley car, a mountain car a track going up there. And these 2 Russians were working there. And when they saw this, the way these Russians were treating these women from the house and shooting the men, they grabbed rifles and shot the guards, shot the Soviets. And then they were shot. Somebody reported on them, and they were shot in the evening.
Would it be possible, could you just say the story about the women being raped and the men being forced to watch and then shot, that you just saying that you saw this yourself,
yes.
that this was something you saw yourself?
Yes, we saw it ourselves.
No, but sorry, so you need to say that story again, but I saw this myself.
Okay, yes, I saw it from our house. We could see over to the Bergbahn Street number 11, where the Russian soldiers went in, pulled the women out on the street, had mattresses that they pulled out, raped the women. The men, fathers or sons, had to watch, and then they were shot. Because they knew that the fathers could never forgive this, forget this.
And what did you feel when you saw these sights?
Well, of course, had the feeling you wanted to stop it, but there was no possibility to do that. As a matter of fact, immediately on the other side of the street is the restaurant, a well-known restaurant in Dresden, the Luisenhof. The Soviet soldiers set that afire, and Americans, former prisoners of war who had come to us, went in there to put the fire out, and the Soviets didn't like that at all. And what was going on, you have to understand that the Soviet soldiers were told that Hitler wanted to create a super race, and so their instructions were to mess it up, to prevent a super race from being developed. So the raping was not just a action on behalf of a soldier who was out of order, but it was part of their duty.
Because what Soviet soldiers who we interview say, they said, well, a bit of that may have gone on, but people were then held to account and punished for it. So, it's like any other army going into a town.
No, it was not like any other army. That things happen in every army that is not good. have to accept that possibly. But this was, we were told it was an order from Zhukov, but if it was or wasn't, we don't know.
But was there any sense you had, if you said to the Soviet authorities about your factory, and did you say, look, these girls are being abused, they work here, what's happening, can it be stopped? Was that something you tried to do?
Oh yes, we did that.
So what happened when you said those things?
They said that they would keep an eye on it, but they stationed 2 officers in the factory to watch over that things were not being destroyed or people were not being misused. But privately, when they went home, there was no control anymore.
And the other thing people say is, oh, well, these rapes may have happened, but it was only in the immediate first days of occupation. Then, very quickly, order came along.
I have to say that is not true either. It depends upon how long you call long. 3 weeks, 3 months, it was still going on.
So there was simply no... And these women had no recourse. They couldn't go... You couldn't say, well, make a formal complaint to the Soviet authority.
No.
Why not? If it was what they say was a crime, why did that never occur to anyone to actually say, well, this crime is happening?
Let me go a step further. When I know I'm going ahead of it a little bit, but when we were taken to prison, they said, don't look for justice, don't ask for justice. There is no justice. There is no justice here. We won the war. We can do anything we want to do.
And this was actually said to you?
This was said to us, yes.
By who?
By the officers. There is no justice, and they proved to be right. I can mention cases there in the prison in Dresden where I don't know how much detail I should go into, but take, for example, there's a 10-year-old boy who was accused of blowing up a bridge. He said he didn't do it. He was tortured. The doctor and I had to take him from the interrogation room back to his cell, tried to patch him up as good as we could. When he was called again, he again denied blowing up the bridge, was again tortured. Third time he couldn't take the torture anymore, and so he said, okay, I blew up the bridge. And so they left him in peace for a while, but still in prison. And then they called him again. They said, look, we found out that bridge was never blown up. You lied to a Soviet officer. Because you lied, you're going to get 10 years. And he got his 10 years, but he died in prison already.
This was a 10-year-old boy?
A 10-year-old boy.
And which prison was this in?
Dresden prison. Münchner Pass prison.
And this was somebody you knew personally, this little boy?
Well, you see, I kept the records there in the prison for about 9 months. Or no, longer than that, a little over a year. And I had to, when somebody was being sentenced to death, for example, I had to pass out a piece of paper so that they could write a request for clemency. And I did this, and the moment they had written it, I had to call the commander of the prison, and he had come down. He would accept the paper, not even look at it, tear it to pieces, and the prisoner, of course, had his last hopes set on that. The youngest that was executed in prison that I saw being executed was a 9-year-old.
You saw this 9-year-old being executed?
Yes.
Wait, a 9-year-old boy? Or?
A 9-year-old boy.
And how was he executed?
The executions took place in prison where they were stripped of their clothes. It was my job to pick up the clothes, to distribute it to cells where they needed clothes. So I saw everyone that was being executed there. Then they were moved into a partially destroyed part of the prison building, given instructions, turn to the right and turn to the left. And while they were still following orders, they were shot in the back of the head. And their bodies were dumped into a former torture cell, a rubberized cell. The rubber was gone already, but a former rubberized cell. And then a helper and I had to roll barrels of gasoline through it. The gasoline was poured over the bodies and they were burned.
So they didn't know when, did they know they were going to be shot in this way? Or
well,
did it come as a surprise they were back?
They had been sentenced to death. They knew that. The request for clemency was not accepted. They knew that. When they were being stripped of their clothes, they had to expect it. But the guards always bragged about it. They said that the prisoner didn't know that moment because they were still following orders, turn to the right and turn to the left and so on. And so they thought it was very humane.
So they didn't know. So they were just not walking when they were doing it. They were being told just to turn in a room to the right, to the left, and someone.
No, they were walking down the hallway.
Right.
And out of the one wing into the other wing, and then again around. And while they were walking and being ordered to turn to the right and turn to the left and so on, they were shot.
And this is what happened to this 9-year-old boy.
So it happened to the 9-year-old boy. It happened to 400 while I was in charge of the records here.
And what can possibly be your feelings when you see this 9-year-old boy shot in this way?
When you see something like that, or when you know that they're being taken away to be shot, you have a feeling of helplessness, of anger, of wanting to intervene in some way possible. And it just simply wasn't possible. I was a prisoner myself. My father was in the prison, and if they'd take it out on me or take it out on my dad.
And what was your feeling at that time that these were our allies who had helped us defeat Nazism?
It's a little bit hard perhaps to explain, because I never felt that they were allies. I really never did. Their life style was so totally different, and yet later on I got to know the Russian people, and the Russian people as such are very kind-hearted, very generous people. They have nothing in common with the party or with the army and so on. It's a totally different story. But so that I don't want to, when I say that they were crude type individuals, I can't say that this is typical for the Russians. It isn't typical for the Russians. But these are, you have to understand, these are all KGB people, or at that time NKVD, of course. And these NKVD people, they were recruited out of children that were born and taken away from their parents, raised in special schools, had no mom or dad, had no relatives, no one to love, no one to be loved from, and the only one that they followed orders with the state.
Well, we skipped ahead a bit there to see your story, fascinating stuff. But you'd seen these atrocities firsthand, but they let you carry on with the camera works, and then. How was it that you found yourself arrested? What were the sequence of events that meant that you found yourself and your father found yourselves under arrest?
Well, we manufactured cameras, but we did not manufacture lenses, and we had to get the lenses from Jena, from Zeiss. And so we had to tell the Russians we can manufacture the cameras, but we can't make them usable until we have the lenses, and we have to get the lenses from West Germany. Zeiss was at that time, Jena was at the beginning in the West. And so they gave us permission, or gave us actually orders to go to Zeiss to get lenses there. And so my dad and I drove over to the west, crossed the border, went into Zeiss, ordered the lenses, got everything set up there. And when we came back to Dresden, we found that they already had tried to arrest my father and me before we even had left East Germany. So it was either a trap that was set up or, and still, anyhow, we were immediately arrested when we came back, taken to the NKVD headquarters, and then taken into the prison. And
why did they say you'd been arrested?
They told me that I was being arrested because I'm a witness for my father. And my father, they said they just wanted to check the papers to make sure that the American citizenship was accurate and things like that. As a matter of fact, Buchenwald, the head of the office there in Dresden, the Soviet office in Dresden, he came to my father and had a piece of yellow paper in his hand, and he said, "We just got a telegram from New York that your citizenship has been canceled." And my father said to him, "If you got any information whatsoever about my citizenship, it would come from Washington, not from New York." And the officer just tore that piece of paper, threw it away, and walked out. It was just a bluff.
And so even at that stage, your crime that merited physical detention and arrest was that you knew someone who they were questioning their citizenship. That was the offence.
I suppose, first of all, I think we have to assume that the Soviets didn't know whom to arrest when they moved into Germany. So they depended upon someone to denounce them. And that there could have been someone who maybe wanted to hide some of his own crime and say, look, hey, why don't you arrest the nobles? Look, they've got the factory there. They were able to run the factory even during wartime. So they obviously are on the wrong side or something like that. And the Soviets had no idea whom to arrest. It was just strictly the Germans that handed others over to them.
So you'll never know, but perhaps you were denounced in some way? Or?
Well, there's one man, for example, or there are two men in the factory that during the Nazi time they were placed up by the Nazi government as sort of, they worked, but they were overseers. Upmen, they were called. And when the Soviets had moved in, they came and had the red armband on their arm, the same two, and wanted again to be present at all hearings, at all meetings, at all decisions and so on. And my dad rebuked them very heavily. And so we expect or believe that one of them probably did something like this. Because the day my father was released from prison, he took his life. So he probably felt that he was going to get in trouble.
And so you were placed in Dresden prison initially. Again, did you think, well, this will all be sorted out, I'm an American. You kept your American citizenship, so you're still an American citizen.
Right.
So surely the embassy will intervene. They must have, you might not think they're our allies, but the US, these were the American allies in the war. Aren't they going to sort this out? Did you have those sorts of feelings?
When Dad and I went to West Germany to get the lenses, we had the thought in our mind, well, if this is Soviet territory, going to stay Soviet territory, then we may want to move the factory to the west. This was our thinking. And so we went to Kassel, which at that time was the headquarters for the American forces. And there they told us there's no need to be worried about anything. The Soviets are not going to stay there in Dresden. The Soviets are going to move back. And so we dropped that thought of moving the factory to the west. But as far as we're concerned, we already told them there at the American headquarters that in Dresden, for example, 225 Americans had been arrested by the Soviets, POWs. Instead of turning them over or letting them go, they were taken in by the Soviets and moved off. And they said, that can't be. The Soviets are allies. The Soviets wouldn't do a thing like that. It's totally naivety that was playing a very important role there.
Did you mention to them, for example, the atrocities that have been committed in Dresden?
Oh, yes.
So what did you say to them?
Well, but they said, you have the flag flying there, and they have not bothered you, so you don't have to worry about a thing.
But what about the notion that we were allied to somebody whose troops were committing these terrible atrocities unpunished?
Well, of course, I didn't know if these officers or these Soviet soldiers that had committed these atrocities were not punished. I had no way of knowing that. I had no idea. In prison, I know what happened there. There was a Dutch girl, for example, in prison who was raped by one of the guards, but she had been called to interrogation a number of times, and the commander had taken apparently a liking towards the girl, or at least felt a kinship with this girl. And that night, that guard that raped her, when she was called again, he was taken out and shot. I mean, there was no court trial or anything like that. Life doesn't mean a thing so much to them.
So there you were in Dresden prison. I'm just wondering if we should cut now and reset, Michael. How are we doing on this mag? How are we
We've got another 15 minutes left.
Okay, let's just reset for Buchenwald. Okay. So, Miss Noble, how was it that you were arrested in Dresden prison where you spent some time, but how was it in 1948 that you found yourself here in Buchenwald?
Okay, from Dresden, after being 14 months in the Dresden prison, we were shipped off to... Those that were sentenced to death were shot and destroyed. Those that were sentenced were sent to Bautzen. Those that were not sentenced and those that the Soviets didn't know what to do with, they were sent to the Camp Mühlberg or Jamlich-Ketzendorf. These are the three major camps that they were sent to. And Dad and I were sent to Mühlberg on the Elbe. And from Mühlberg, after those camps were half starved out, and the remnant was sent here to Buchenwald in 48. What I was just going to say about Mühlberg, in French, there are a couple of French citizens there, two French girls and a French fellow. And the one French girl became pregnant, which was it was hardly possible for any contact between men and women, but somehow it became possible. And so she was called to the political office of Tanozhanov, and he asked her, is it the Frenchman that was the father? And she knew that if she would say yes, then he'd be tortured and he wouldn't survive. So she said, no, it's not him. It was him, but she said, no, it's not him. And so he said, okay, if he was not the father, then you've lost your French citizenship. And she went back to the barracks, and with help of some of the women, she performed an abortion, wrapped the fetus in a cloth, reported back to Tanozhanov, threw it on his desk, and said, give me my citizenship back. And it sounds brutal or something like this, but to a foreigner, during being in Germany, a foreign citizenship is a very vital thing. It's something that they do not want to lose, can't afford to lose. And so she even took that kind of a risk.
And do you think your American citizenship helped you at this point in your captivity?
Not officially. Officially, I was not treated any different than anyone else was treated. I think that through help from other prisoners who maybe psychologically were looking towards America as the only way ever to correct something, that they helped us along or were kinder to us or so. In Russia, I realized very much so that let me try to answer your question this way, really. In prison, in the Dresden prison, I went through a starvation period. The whole prison went through a starvation period. We had first 3 days without any food whatsoever. And we already had been starved down to skin and bones. And so people were knocking against the doors, calling, cursing, kicking the doors, and so on. And but no food came. During the night, someone called from another cell. I could hear it echo in the prison hall. If there were a God in heaven, he wouldn't let this happen. And I asked myself, well, is there a God in heaven? If so, would he let this happen? And I knew that human help was not available, so I thought I'd never gone to church, I'd never prayed, I'd never thanked God for anything, but now I was in trouble. And so I wondered whether if I could call upon him to help me. And I prayed, no food the next day, no food the next day, no food the next day. And I was so discouraged, I said, it's no use anymore. But then we had 2 days of food, not much, but a little bit. And then a new starvation period started, and I felt it's probably going to go on for another 3 days without, and then 2 days with a little bit. I think everybody felt that way. But when it went on to the 4th day and to the 5th day, people gave up, and once you give up, you're dead. And I became so weak that I could not lift my feet from the floor. I couldn't talk anymore. The voice was gone. And as I lay down on my bunk, it was the 5th or 6th day, I don't remember exactly, I prayed and I said, Lord, close my eyes and keep them closed. I can't stand it anymore. But if there is a life for me, it's not mine. Mine's over with. If there's a life, it's all yours. So everything changed. It changed so drastically that I could walk the next day, I could talk the next day. And this gave me the feeling, the strength. The Soviets can't do with me what they want to do. And this literally carried me through those 9.5 unforgettable years in the hands of the Soviets. And I think that because of this, I took a different stand towards things. Another example, if I may, just very quickly, the General Klebov, who was in charge of the KGB for Saxony, or I don't know, even a bigger area, he came to the prison. He knew me. I didn't know him, but he knew me because he was involved when they first tried to arrest my father and myself. Anyhow, Klebov came and said, set up a couple of tables in a cell. I want to talk to every prisoner personally. And as I was doing this, setting the things up, he said, "Now look, you are taking care of the records here in the prison. You do messenger work here in the prison. You know just about everything that's going on, don't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Is there something I ought to know?" And I said, "Mr. General, if you were in my shoes and you knew something, would you report it?" He said, "No." He said, "Don't expect me to." I mean, it takes quite a bit of courage to say something like that to a Soviet, but I had come to the point where I felt superior to them and felt that they couldn't harm me. And this possibly gave me the ability to live through those years and survive, more so than other prisoners who are constantly afraid of what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next.
Incredible. And why do you, on the starvation, what, did you have any sense that there was any meaning towards that? What was the point in doing that to you?
The prison was filled to capacity, and they were arresting people, had no place to put them. And I honestly believe that they simply wanted to clear out the prison, and they did. Out of the 700 that were there, only 22 or 23 survived, and then the prison was filled up again.
So it's just a method of killing people more slowly, more painfully than shooting, but you save the bullets.
Yeah, exactly. I may be wrong, but I personally feel, I know there was a shortage of food everywhere right after the war in Germany, but not so that they didn't have anything at all.
Yeah. And so we're talking then about, so you arrive at Buchenwald. What sort of condition were you in when you came to Buchenwald, and what sort of condition was the camp in when you got here?
The camp, well, if you look across this gravel area here, this was the roll call area. The barracks were all down below there. Just before the woods down there were the Jewish barracks. They had 3 Jewish barracks here. And then they had the concrete building where the chemical experiments took place during the Nazi time, where prisoners were told that if they survived 3 minor or 1 major chemical test, that they would be released. Well, they didn't survive them, so they weren't released. But even those buildings were torn away. But the camp was strictly a non-working camp. It was a concentration camp where you're not supposed to work. You're supposed to concentrate. You're supposed to find fault with yourself, or why did you say this, or why did you believe this, or why, and so on. But there were crews that had to work. In the kitchen there were crews, in the crematory there were crews, in the bakery there were crews. My father and I always asked for work. And we got a job with that cart that's still back there to make gravel and to distribute gravel between the barracks or on the roads and so on.
So you're talking about the kind of work that you and your father did. Tell me again about the cart. What was the point of the cart that you had that's over there? What were you doing with that?
We